Chapter 2, Death and the Void. Beep, beep, beep. The alarm rung for the nth time today, and just like the past few times, a hand moved from under the covers and tapped the phone screen, snoozing the alarm. Silence returned to the apartment room again as it failed to do its job once more. Well, it was not that he had been asleep in the first place. The room was illuminated on the screen of a laptop which was laying on his chest, his tired eyes reading through the pages of the manhwa before him. How cliché, he muttered. And yet, he had reread this chapter more times than he could count. He had read it so much that he knew every line of dialogue. He also knew the exact panel where the prince would raise his hand to strike and the moment the crowd would turn against her. He knew that in 3 chapters, the author would begin her social downfall, building her as the villain she was supposed to become. And in 47 chapters, her death. He now knew this manhwa by heart, and yet, for some reason, he kept reading it over and over again. Well, he knew exactly why he was stuck on it, and it was all due to a single name, Renelle Ardent. She was the final villainess of the manhwa, the Saintess and the Silver Crown. It was a story as cliché as any one told many times over, and yet, he had read it over and over for a single reason only, the villainess. It wasn't because he thought she was misunderstood or anything. After all, after this chapter, her spiral would begin, and she would become a proper villainess. Rather, it was just an unexplainable infatuation ever since she first appeared way back in chapter 20. He was someone who felt no emotions. He understood them, of course, and he could very much recognize grief, joy, anger, love, fear. He could instantly identify them on the faces of others, but only because he had spent years studying human reactions back when he was concerned with seeming normal. Yet all this was changed by a single panel from a manhwa, and thus his obsession was born. Of course this was abnormal, but so was he. And he was self-aware enough to admit that much. After all, normal people didn't fall for a bunch of inks and pixels. Slowly, he placed the laptop on the bed and got off the bed. A wave of dizziness hit him, but he managed to catch himself before he could fall. He walked towards his bathroom, coming to face with his reflection that seemed to stare right back at him. He had messy black hair, dark gray eyes with unusually heavy bags beneath them. But that wasn't surprising. After all, he hadn't slept in, 30 hours? If he had a choice, he'd stay cooped up inside reading, but as an adult that belonged to a society, he had responsibilities. "You're pathetic," he muttered as he stared at his reflection. As a 23-year-old, he had no reason to be wasting most of his day obsessing over a fictional character, and yet, here he was. Splashing cold water on his face seemed to help wake him up a bit more, the cold shower doing the rest of the work. Stepping out, he underwent his routine, dressing up in whatever was both comfortable and fit for a work environment, crossing his work bag and stepping out the door. But not before glancing once more towards the laptop. The screen was dim, but he could clearly see Renelle's cold face that seemed to be looking directly at him. "Wish me luck," he muttered before finally closing the door and stepping into the apartment's hallway. The thing about not getting enough sleep was that everything suddenly became a lot louder and irritating. But he was used to it. Kind of. He stepped out the apartment building, the sound of the city hitting him fully, but there wasn't a single change in his expression. He calmly walked towards the nearest bus station, with a couple of people bumping into him and apologizing, to which he paid no mind. "It's late," he muttered as he glanced at the clock on his phone while waiting for the bus to arrive. Usually it'd have arrived by now, but it was running late for some reason. Slowly, he lifted his head from the screen and suddenly, all sound seemed to disappear. It felt as if everything had gone completely still. And before he had the chance to understand what was going on, he spotted something strange. A doll. It stood in the middle of the street, unnervingly still, and utterly out of place among the bustling city crowd. Its body was perfectly proportioned, but its face was featureless, save for the tightly stitched line where a mouth should have been. 1 second he was on the sidewalk, staring at the doll. The next, he was standing in its place with the doll now exactly where he had been. They had somehow swapped places? Was the only thing he could let out before. Bang! Something heavy slammed into him, crushing every bit of bone in his body and sending him ragdolling. Everywhere hurt, and he couldn't even breathe as his brain struggled to understand the sequence of events. Slowly, the sounds that had returned seemed a lot distant, almost as if people were screaming and calling for help from afar. He had been hit by a truck, hadn't he? The last thing he saw before the blackness swallowed him completely was the doll. Its stitched mouth was somehow smiling, and that's when darkness took him. Cold. That was the first thing he felt when his senses returned. How peculiar, he heard someone say as his eyes slowly opened. Once his eyes were fully opened, he realized that he was floating in absolute darkness. It was darkness so potent that he couldn't even see his own hands, if he had any. Is this death? He muttered, looking around. If it was, then it definitely wasn't what he expected. Now, he really wasn't religious, but he had at least expected death to be a lot more than him floating endlessly in the void. Fascinating. The voice spoke up again, pulling his attention towards it. Not only can your soul handle my power, it seems you're becoming one with it. The voice seemed to come from all around at once. Before he could say or ask anything, the being spoke again. Very well then. It paused for a short while before adding, entertain me, mortal. With that, he heard what sounded like a snap. With it, a sudden pressure fell on him as he felt the darkness latch onto him. It was a painful experience, one that felt as if his very soul was being ripped apart. He was sure that if his face could be seen right now, his expression would definitely be ugly. But even through all that, he didn't let out a single scream, and again, slowly, darkness took him. The moment his consciousness faded, the darkness moved, creating an outline of a robed man with white glowing eyes. The being stared at the unconscious soul before it and muttered, "This should be entertaining." Chapter 3, Adrian. A wooden ceiling was the first thing that came to view as his eyes slowly opened. This was definitely not the hospital, nor was it his apartment as evident by the old wood that made up the ceiling. He then noticed that he was laying on something that was both cold and hard, probably the floor, as no bed he had ever lay on felt this hard and rough. Slowly, he took a sitting position, letting out a wince. It felt as if he had been laying unmoving for a long while. He then, finally, had the chance to look around, and he noticed that he was in a small room with walls made of the same wood as the ceiling. A wooden desk with a couple of books on it. A truck tucked away at the corner. A wooden bed just a few steps away from him, and a mirror were the only furnishing this room had. A pre-death dream? That was the only explanation he could come up with. After all, he remembered very clearly being hit by a truck. So maybe this was a case of the brain trying to comfort itself as it had noticed the impending death. But then again, wasn't it supposed to be replaying 7 minutes of his happiest memories? Not that he remembered having any, but still. He was sure he had never been to or seen a place such as this, so why was his brain replaying it? Besides, why did every sensation feel so real if this was supposed to be a dream? Unless this wasn't a dream and he had somehow been kidnapped after the truck accident and brought here. No, that doesn't make sense either, he muttered, placing a hand on his chin. I'm not important enough to be kidnapped for no reason. He paused, noticing another strange detail, his voice. Although it was still his, it sounded a lot younger than he remembered. He stood up only to be hit by a wave of dizziness, but he managed to catch himself before slowly walking towards the mirror. It was just a gut feeling, one that would or would not be confirmed by his reflection. He soon reached the mirror, only to freeze at what he saw. Yes, the reflection staring back was undeniably his, with the same black hair, gray eyes and dark circles that told of countless sleepless nights. The only strange part was, he looked younger than he remembered, maybe 5 years younger. With a view of his reflection came a sudden, unexpected headache, one that seemed to want to force him to his knees, which it did. And with the headache carried set of memories, none that belonged to him. He didn't know how long the headache lasted, maybe it was a few minutes, maybe an hour, but when it finally faded, he was left laying on the stone floor in a pool of his own sweat, despite the cold. He lay there for a couple of seconds, staring at the ceiling as he regained his focus, and the moment he did, ha ha ha. It started out as a chuckle before it transformed into a full-blown laughter, one that filled the small room. If someone saw him right now, they'd be convinced that he had lost his mind, but it wasn't as if he would care. It took him a couple of minutes, but he finally calmed himself and sat up straight again, staring at his reflected self in the mirror. According to the memories he just received, his name was Adrian and this world was known as Avera. Why was that important? Well, one, it confirmed his thoughts. He had definitely reincarnated, or was it transmigration? Now, he wasn't a stranger to the reincarnation trope and the legendary cause of it, Trukuin, but had he expected it to happen to him? Not in the least bit. But the best part was, he hadn't been reincarnated into just any world. As if the goddess of fate herself had taken notice of his obsession, he had been reborn into the world of his favorite manhwa, the Saintess and the Silver Crown, the very same manhwa where his favorite character, Renelle Ardent, existed. He calmed himself down as he slowly rearranged the memories dumped in his head to better understand his situation. Adrian was an orphan, picked up from the streets at the very young age by the Ardent family, more specifically, by Renelle Ardent herself. It was a memory that stood out the most among the rest. A blizzard had swallowed the northern streets that day, snow had piled high against storefronts, and the wind was as chilly as ever, blowing unforgiving against those with nowhere to warm themselves. He, Adrian, had been small, starving, and half buried beneath the snow when a carriage bearing the Ardent crest passed by. Guided by pure desperation, he jumped before it, forcing the horses to a halt and inviting a lecture session from the coachman. The man had shouted, furious at the audacity of a street rat throwing himself in front of a noble carriage, but the reprimand never went far. The carriage door had opened before the coachman could drag the boy away. Ut stepped a beauty that only belonged to one of noble lineage. She had hair as white as the snow and eyes as blue as crystals. She looked only a bit older than the boy, and yet was a lot more refined. But that was what being born in a noble family did to you. She looked at the young Adrian for a short while before asking, "What do you want?" His lips had been blue from the cold, his body shaking violently, but he had still forced the words out. "I can work." He could have begged for warm food, for clothing or anything, but even he knew that those wouldn't last him long, if at all. The girl looked at him for a while longer before turning to the coachman. "Pick him up," she ordered calmly. And from that day onward, Adrian had belonged to the Ardent household. He had not been adopted as family, nor treated as a cherished ward. He had been fed, clothed, and trained. In exchange, he would be a loyal dog to the lady, one that should bark when told to and die when told to. According to the memories, Adrian was still undergoing training to be the perfect servant to the lady, and he was currently taking the final test, the one which led to his death. Spirit Contract. Chapter 4. Spirit Contracts and a Black Cat. The Saintess and the Silver Crown, keeping with its cliché streak, had a power system that had been done a few too many times. Spirit Contracts. Humans in this world, although capable of absorbing and storing mana, they couldn't use it freely, thus making that mana useless. And that's where spirits come in. They're entities born from a specific type of mana in the air, whether that be ice, fire, or even light mana. Like humans, while the spirits can freely shape the mana of their element to their liking, they can only use a fixed amount of mana they're born from without replacement. This meant that once their mana ran out, they'd disappear forever, which was the equivalent of them dying. So, the two parties would come together and form a mutually beneficial contract, hence a spirit contract. This contract granted humans the ability to use mana based on their contracted spirits, and it granted spirits replenishment through the humans' natural mana regeneration. The only problem to this was that the spirits were extremely picky. Even for little bastards that were running on time limits, they were extremely choosy of who they formed a contract with. And unfortunately for the former Adrian, not a single spirit wanted to become contracted with him. Not even lesser spirits. His final test, which would ensure his placement by Lady Renelle's side, was to contract a spirit that was at least at advanced rank. A task which he had failed at spectacularly. Not a single lesser spirit had acknowledged him. Common spirits ignored him outright. Even the temperamental ones that normally latched onto anyone with decent mana reserves had rejected him without hesitation. It was as if something about him repelled them. But the former Adrian was unwilling to give up. He had been desperate. Desperate to justify the years of training the ardent family had invested in him. Desperate to prove that the life she had spared in that blizzard had not been wasted. And desperation breeds recklessness. He turned towards the desk, on which lay a book most candidates were forbidden from touching. It was a dusty one with what seemed to be leather as its cover. It was so old that even the title had been nearly erased by time, but you could still see a bit of what was written. On unclassified entities and pre-recorded contract failures. Unknown spirits. They were spirits that did not fall into the standard hierarchy of lesser, common, advanced, superior, prime, or ancient. They had no elemental classification, nor had they ever been properly documented. Even so, the former Adrian saw this as his only hope. According to the memories, he had followed every instruction in the book, down to the letter, a summoning circle made from his blood. One that had already dried up on the floor behind him. And enough mana to leave him almost empty, which wasn't a small amount after all. Even the trainers here had been surprised by just how much mana his body could hold, and he had almost poured all that into the circle. What happened after that was blurry, but the last thing the previous Adrian remembered was pain, and that's where the memories ended, which meant one thing. He died before my soul occupied his body, he said, which is probably why he never appeared in the manhwa. The manhwa had never mentioned Adrian at all, which made sense now. He had died before the story even began. Well, he wasn't too sure if the story had already begun, but still, Adrian died too soon to be relevant. Though this seems a bit too convenient, he muttered as he stood up again. I guess I'll be Adrian from this moment on. Adrian slowly walked towards the dried blood before placing a finger on it, wondering if the summoning had succeeded or not. Don't tell me you already forgot about our contract. A voice suddenly came from behind him, forcing him to turn around, and that's when he spotted it on the bed. A black cat. Its eyes seemed a bit too intelligent for a household cat, and although he couldn't explain it, the creature gave of this terrifying aura. Adrian stared at the creature on the bed, his expression slowly flattening. A cat. The black feline sat upright on the wooden bed as if it owned the place. He still couldn't shake off the pressure this cat released, especially now that he had noticed something. All the light that reached its fur was quickly absorbed. Its eyes, however, were the most unsettling part. They glowed faintly, pale and almost silver, and they carried a level of awareness no normal animal should possess. The cat tilted its head slightly. How rude, the voice spoke again. Yet the creature's mouth never moved. But I guess you truly did forget. Maybe a side effect of the contract. Adrian looked at the cat, then back at the summoning circle as he came to the conclusion. So it worked, he muttered. Of course it worked. Adrian crossed his arms as he stared at the creature. So you're the unknown spirit? The cat didn't answer immediately. Instead, it slowly lifted a paw and slowly began licking it. For some reason, the action seemed as elegant as can be, which was ridiculous. Spirit? It finally said, seemingly sounding amused as if he had said some funny joke. You may call me whatever helps your tiny human mind understand the situation. That answer didn't help at all, and it caused Arian to frown slightly. If he was going to help the lady, he had to account for every single anomaly that would shift the story off course. And right now, he and this cat were the biggest ones. Well, not that he cared for a change in the storyline anyway. After all, if things play out as they did in the manhwa, then Renelle would end up dying, and he wouldn't allow that. Anyway, he still needed to know what type of spirit this was. Spirits in this world usually had some kind of elemental signature. Fire spirits radiated heat. Ice spirits chilled the air around them. Light spirits were said to glow faintly. So given its fur, a darkness spirit? Neither he nor the former Adrian knew of spirits known as darkness or dark spirits, but given that he didn't follow conventional methods, he shouldn't expect conventional results either. I guess you can call me that for now, the cat said as it stretched. But I could just show you if you truly are curious. For some reason, that sounded like an extremely bad idea, so he just shook his head. I'll pass, Adrian said before adding. Though I still need to know what element you're aligned with so I can plan properly. I see. The cat muttered before the shadow it cast suddenly expanded, and enveloped the cat's entire body in what seemed to be a cocoon. When it dispersed, the cat was gone, and the next second Adrian felt a weight on his head as the cat spoke again. "For now, we're only limited to shadow manipulation," it explained. "I see," he muttered. "Then that should be useful enough. So, how do I—" Before his words could be completed, a knock interrupted. "Knock! Knock!" Chapter 5, Sebastian. "Knock! Knock!" A knock was heard on his door before it went silent, and according to Adrian's memories, only one person knocks like that. Letting out a sigh, he walked towards the door, with the cat still on his head. Extending his hand towards the wooden door, Adrian pulled it open and came to face with exactly who he expected. Standing on the other side of the door was a man who seemed to be in his late 50s. He had a head full of neatly combed white hair, a beard to match, and a pair of green eyes. He also had on a monocle and a formal black tailcoat that looked as though it had never once known a wrinkle. Beneath it was a white shirt and a silver waistcoat. A pair of white gloves covered his hands, one of which rested calmly behind his back while the other held a slender cane. Everything about him was immaculate. Not a speck of dust, or rather snow, touched his shoes, and his posture was the definition of perfection. Adrian immediately recognized him. The head butler of the Arden estate, the man responsible for overseeing the training of every candidate selected to serve the Arden family. A man whose discipline bordered on tyranny. Sebastian Wells. He was quite an important character in the Manhwa, especially to the Arden family. Even through Renel's villainy arc, which led to the family's downfall, he was the only servant that had stuck with them till the very end. He had been executed just after Renel's death, as he had refused to abandon the family even when their fate had already been sealed. A loyal man to a fault, which meant he was an important ally to keep, and the only way to get a man such as him by your side was to be useful to the Arden family. Adrian's eyes calmly scanned the man. Meanwhile, the cat on his head also curiously looked at the stranger. Sebastian also noticed the cat, and his monocle gleamed as his eyes passed over the cat. But if he found the creature strange, he showed absolutely no sign of it. His expression remained as composed and unreadable as it always was, as he instructed, "Follow me." With that, he turned away without waiting for a reply, expecting Adrian to follow, which he did. Fortunately for him, his shirt was close to the door, so he didn't have to walk out the cold bare-skinned, as he had woken up. Buttoning the shirt up, Adrian fell in line behind the older man, as they walked through the corridor. Aligned on the walls of said corridor were portraits of the Arden family heads, both current and past. The figures within them stared forward with expressions that ranged from proud to coldly indifferent, their gazes seemingly following anyone who walked past. However, Adrian barely spared the paintings a glance. His attention was instead focused on the environment itself. The corridor was elegant, yes, but not grand. The ceiling was lower than what one would expect from the residence of a great noble house. The chandeliers, while expensive, were modest compared to what Adrian remembered from the Manhwa. Even the carpets beneath their feet, though thick and well-maintained, lacked the extravagant embroidery the Ardent family's true estate was famous for. All these told of one thing: this wasn't the main estate. Now Adrian was sure where they were, since the Manhwa never mentioned a place in the north that wasn't the main estate. But judging from his memories, this place should be some kind of training facility for the Ardent family servants. Or more specifically, personal servants. The two continued forward until they were out of the mansion. The moment the doors opened, a sharp gust of cold wind swept in, carrying with it the faint sting of falling snow. The temperature outside was far harsher than inside the building, the world beyond covered in an endless blanket of white. Snow made way beneath their feet as they descended the short stone steps. Before them stretched a wide training ground. It was a vast open field surrounded by tall iron fences and thick stone pillars etched with faint magical inscriptions. Snow had accumulated across the ground, though several large areas had clearly been cleared recently, revealing hardened earth beneath. A number of figures were already gathered around the edges of the field, all dressed in the same uniform as Adrian. They stood in small clusters, watching the center of the arena with varying expressions of anticipation and nervousness. Candidates. Adrian recognized the situation immediately. This was the final test. Well, the graduation test, the final test would come later. Each trainee selected to serve the ardent family was given several days beforehand to form a contract with a spirit and familiarize themselves with it. Only after that preparation period were they brought here. According to the memories, the task they had was simple: defeat a beast. If they succeeded, they would officially become a personal servant of the ardent family. If they failed, well, he'd rather not find out. Sebastian stopped just a small distance from the iron fence before finally turning back to Adrian. "Step inside," was the only thing he said as he stepped to the side. Without question, Adrian walked into the arena. As he walked further in, the cat leapt effortlessly from his head, landing on the edge of the iron fence. "Good luck, contractor," it said as it got comfortable on the fence. "And make sure you don't die. I don't think I'd ever get someone this compatible with my abilities." Adrian blankly stared at the damn thing. Wasn't it supposed to guide him on the usage of his abilities? But that didn't matter right now as his gray eyes looked towards the far end of the arena where a wall with a gated opening was. He then calmly took a glance all around him. Most candidates either seemed worried for him or for when their turns would eventually come. Adrian tuned all that out and waited for the beast to be released. After all, it was the only obstacle between him and Lady Ranel right now. And every obstacle between them was going to be cleared. But he was about to be reminded that he wasn't looking at the world through the pages anymore. He was now very much a part of it.